Good morning. Welcome to an exclusive inside look at the Federal Reserve. Today we will be discussing the history and current actions of the Fed, as well as the use of monetary policy. First, let's take a step back in time when the Federal Reserve was born. Welcome to the year 1913. President Woodrow Wilson created the Federal Reserve on December 23, 1913, when he signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. This gave the Fed responsibility for setting monetary policy. The Federal Reserve was originally created to prevent bank panics such as the one in 1907. At that time, the public lost all confidence in the U.S. banking system and withdrew all of their deposits. This caused banks to collapse since they did not have anyone to turn to for loans. Luckily, J.P. Morgan could save them, but the government knew they needed a more secure system to prevent future bank panics. The Federal Reserve appeared to be the ultimate solution to all banking problems. However, it failed to live up to its expectations during its first real test, the Great Depression. On October 24th of 1929, America experiences its largest stock market crash. This led to mass chaos and bank failures nationwide. The Federal Reserve's main reason for failing America during this desperate time was due to a lack of organization. Members of the Fed were still unsure of their specific jobs, and nobody could decide what to do. This caused the severity of the Depression to increase. During this time, real output in the U.S. fell nearly 30%, and the unemployment rate rose from 3% to nearly 25%, and many of those with jobs were only able to work part-time. Although the early failures of the Fed left Americans without hope, the Fed redeemed itself in later years. Now, who wants to stick around to learn how the Fed functions in modern-day America? What are the specific actions they take to control the economy? Which type of monetary policy is preferred by economists? And what is the Fed currently reporting? Let's learn more about how the Federal Reserve works. We will now turn this over to Gabby Albez, Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve.
The Federal Reserve ultimately serves as the bank's bank. It controls monetary policy through open market operations, reserve requirements, and the discount rate. Open market operations include the purchase or sale of bonds, primarily the U.S. Treasury bonds. When the Fed sells a bond, it is giving a piece of paper to the buyer and taking the buyer's money in return. This is removing money from circulation and decreasing the money supply. As a result, the interest rate would rise to decrease inflation rates. On the other hand, if the Fed were to buy bonds, the money supply would increase. This would stimulate the economy by decreasing interest rates. This is done to help get the nation out of a recession. Now we will talk about a specific example of open market operations in the 1950s with economist Sidney Einstein.
During World War II, the Federal Reserve bought bonds from the U.S. Treasury to aid in financing the war. The buying of the bonds increased the money supply and did not lead to inflation. This was a major success for the Federal Reserve.
As mentioned earlier, the Fed alters the money supply through changes made to the required reserve ratio. Banks across the nation are required to hold a portion of their deposits as reserves. This portion is not allowed to be loaned out. The excess reserves include the money left over and can be loaned out by banks. If the Federal Reserve increases the reserve requirements, banks must hold a greater portion of their deposits and lend out less money. This decreases the money supply and increases interest rates. As a result, inflation rates decrease. If the Fed wants to increase the money supply to stimulate an economy in a recession or depression, they would decrease the required reserve and interest rates would decrease.
Now let's get a professional opinion. We will ask economist Alyssa Kincaid what she thinks of the Federal Reserve's use of changing the required reserve ratio to control the money supply. Hello, Alyssa. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Erica, for having me today.
What is your view on changing the reserve requirement to alter the money supply versus other means such as open market operations?
Both are effective methods of altering the money supply. However, open market operations are more commonly used. Open market operations are often seen as the primary tool of monetary policy.
What is the ultimate goal of using either open market operations or changing the reserve required ratio?
Monetary policy is one of the ways the government controls the economy. Ultimately, the government wants the inflation rate to be between 2 and 3%. The government can change the growth rate to control the economic state a country is in. There is a fine balance between inflation and recession that the Federal Reserve attempts to reach.
Thank you, Alyssa, for your time and your professional input. Let's go back to hear the rest of what Chairman Gabby Albez has to say about the Federal Reserve's role in monetary policy.
Another job of the Federal Reserve is to alter the discount rate in order to control the money supply. The discount rate is the interest rate the banks pay to borrow money from the Fed. When the rate is low, banks are more likely to borrow from the Fed if their excess reserves do not satisfy their demands for loans.
We will now take a brief commercial break. And we're back. We will now take a look at what the Federal Reserve is reporting today.
I will now discuss the 2012 Federal Reserve press release. The Federal Open Market Committee met in March to determine the future actions of the Federal Reserve. The Fed reported a recent improvement in labor market conditions and a decline in the unemployment rate. Although spending has increased, the housing sector remains depressed. The Federal Reserve anticipates that the economic growth will remain moderate and the unemployment rate will continue to decline. Also, the increase in oil and gas prices early in 2012 will only temporarily affect the inflation rate. With this information in mind, we will now take a look at the 2013 Federal Reserve press release from March. In 2013, there have been some improvements since the previous year. The labor market has improved as well as the housing sector. The committee has decided to continue purchasing government bonds to increase the money supply. This will decrease interest rates and help get the U.S. back to full employment and out of the current recession. Hopefully, the Fed's plans to buy more bonds will lead to an improvement in our economy.
This is all for today's episode of Economics USA. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you all next time.